How's it going, everybody? Welcome to my very messy shop where I am currently working my way through this knife right here. And while this is going to be a future video, a video that I've made in the past was showing y'all how to sharpen a knife from very dull to very sharp, but there's an issue with it. You see, that sharpening video was focused around using the method of a buffing machine with various buffing wheels and various buffing compounds to achieve an extremely sharp razor edge, which is nice and all, but not everybody can afford a full buffing machine with buffing wheels and buffing compounds and everything that comes with that. Sometimes you just have one or two knives that you want to keep sharpened and you want something super simple and easy to really give them a new edge every now and then. So that's what the focus of this video is going to be, showing y'all how to sharpen up y'all knives without any fancy tools or equipment, just doing it the old-fashioned way by hand.
As much as this hurts my soul, I'm gonna take this knife and rub the edge of it around on this file just to make sure that we have a good baseline of a really dull and messed up edge. And as you can see, we were very successful. You can see all the imperfections, all the little nicks and dings on the edge. Just if you want to keep your knife sharp, don't ever, rub it on the edge of a file. Anywho, now that we have a nice dull knife, here's the setup we'll use to sharpen it. First up, we need to get a support board that's just slightly wider than the blade itself, and we'll be clamping the knife to this board, and I'll explain more how it works later, but for now, you just need to get a board slightly wider than the blade and a C-clamp to hold the knife to that piece of wood, as well as the desk underneath it. Now, as to what we'll be using to actually work on the blade itself, we're going to be using automotive sandpaper because it's super easy to get a hold of, it works wet or dry, and just generally it's a little bit tougher than the standard wood sandpaper that you'll find. As you can see, I have 3 different levels of grit here from 320 up to 1500. You can always just grab the pack of assorted grits, which normally is pretty good, as long as you have something that goes into the 1000 to 2000 range for that finishing final edge. Now, in order to apply that sandpaper to the edge consistently, we need a firm backing, so I'm just going to be using an old file. But as I'll explain later, the file is a little bit too hard of a backing, so I'll be using this thin strip of leather, but you could also use cardboard if that's all you have laying around. And yeah, that's pretty much all you need for this method.
So now we have everything set up and ready to go, but before we actually get started, I wanted to take a moment to point out the geometry that we're going for. Now, this is something that I covered in much more detail in my full-length sharpening video from before, so if you need to brush up on that, go check that video out. I'll link it in the description below and probably throw a card up here somewhere. But here's the basics. You have 3 different types of edges that you can go for. One of them is going to be just too thin to really hold an edge for a long time, no matter how good the steel is. One of them is going to be a wedge edge, which is not going to cut very efficiently, but it'll be more durable. And one of them is going to be the appleseed edge. And the appleseed edge is what you kind of want to go for. Rather than having 2 angles coming together exactly, you're going to have those angles slightly rounded off so that there's enough beef behind the edge to last over time, but there's not so much friction and interference from a full-blown wedge edge. So with that clarified, we're going for an appleseed edge. That's why we use this leather backing behind the file. If we were to just use the file itself, we would run into 2 different issues. First of all, it would probably wear right through the sandpaper with that hard of a backing, and you would introduce the edge of this file to the edge of the knife, which is not a good combination. On top of that, unless you're very experienced, you would end up creating an uneven wedge edge, which just isn't exactly what we're going for. So that's where the leather comes in. By having this somewhat pliant leather backing behind the sandpaper, what we're doing is allowing this sandpaper to conform to the shape of the blade as it is already, but to ever so slightly curve around that edge, which ends up creating that appleseed edge effect we're going for. So with all that clarified and the geometry of what you're going for explained, let's go ahead and hop into actually sharpening this thing.
Alright, so we're about halfway through the video and I'm just now getting to the point of showing you how to actually sharpen the knife. And that's because it's mainly all about the setup. The sharpening process itself is really simple. All you have to do is make sure that you have the angle generally correct. If you're slightly off, the leather will kind of adjust for that because again, it kind of conforms to the angles that are already there. Basically, you don't want to be too flat with the profile of the blade, and you don't want to be too straight up and down, just knocking the edge off. You want to find that smaller contour that goes right along the edge and kind of just generally match that. Then it's just a matter of applying some firm pressure and smoothly going back and forth over it in a, sanding motion. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind when doing this. The first thing is consistency from side to side. You don't want to spend all your time on one side because that would make the edge uneven. You want to focus on just removing those imperfections from the edge, so once it starts to look a little smoother, go ahead and flip it over to the other side and repeat the same process. You kind of go back and forth, removing a little more and a little more until those imperfections are pretty much worn down off the edge.
Alright, so after doing that for quite a while, we've worked the edge down, getting rid of those huge dents and dings that we put in it with the file, and now we're down to just some very minor imperfections. That's something we can easily work out with the next grit, and we want to get this edge as fine as possible, so let's move on to that grit. In this case specifically, I'm going with 600 grit. If you want to worry about your shine of the blade, and if you really want to do this right, then you can go with several different step-ups in between, so like 320 to 400 to 500, 600, 700, 800. You can make as many steps as you want. But for the learning purpose of this video, I'm going 320 to 600 to 1500. So with that being said, let's use this 600 grit to make this edge a lot more refined.
Now, as you can see, using the 600 grit is pretty much identical to using the 320 grit. You just have to be a little bit more slow and methodical with the strokes because you don't want to accidentally end up cutting yourself on this newly sharpened edge. And speaking of which, you have to be careful that the knife doesn't cut the sandpaper itself. Just keep an eye out for that, and if it happens, just move over to a fresh patch and you should be fine. Once you've gotten both sides nice and sharpened up with this 600 grit, it's time to actually work on the blade itself and try to get rid of some of those scratches from the 320 grit. You don't want to be messing up your blade with a whole bunch of scratches during the sharpening process, so all you have to do is take this 600 grit and smooth it over and everything should look good again.
Alright, so after using the 600 grit for a little while, we should be able to notice much bigger improvements in our blade's sharpness. And at this point, not only should you be feeling a massive difference in terms of the edge's sharpness, but you should also be getting to the stage where you can start cutting loose hanging things like paper. So depending on your use case, that might actually be enough for you. But in this case, just for learning purposes, we're going to go the extra mile all the way up to 1500 grit and really get this thing to a very fine edge. So let's get to it.
Now for this final step, we'll be switching up our method a little bit because we're going to be doing more honing than just grinding off the edge. So rather than holding the sandpaper and rubbing it on the knife like we've been doing, we're going to put the leather on our support board and the sandpaper over that and hold it in place however you'd like. And this ends up making something equivalent to a whetstone, just a lot cheaper. Have you seen how expensive whetstones are lately? Anywho, the idea here is just basic honing. You match the angle of the blade to the sandpaper, press firmly and drag it towards you, and then push it away from you, dragging the blade and pulling everything to a very nice fine edge. Doing this part right does take quite a bit of practice, but once again, we have the leather backing underneath the sandpaper, so that's a little bit forgiving, and it will somewhat match to the edge as long as you have the correct amount of pressure on it. You don't want to be just cramming down on it, but you want to be pressing fairly firmly and evenly across the entire edge. And just like with the 600 grit, once you have everything nice and honed and sharpened, go ahead and take a few extra pieces of that 1500 grit and polish off the blade just to keep it looking good and nice.
Alrighty, so after a little time honing the blade with this 1500 grit, this blade is pretty much as sharp as you're gonna get it. The paper test? Yeah, it does so well that you can barely even see the small tiny little slivers of paper that I'm cutting off, which means that this blade is really sharp. What about something thicker though, like some thick leather? Yeah, I can cut through 1/4 inch thick leather with this blade like it's butter. So that's plenty good enough. And just for good measure, even though this knife is not designed to do something like this, I can use it like a planer blade and cut wood just like it's nothing. This blade is plenty sharp enough, and I'm really happy with the results. And well, that brings me to the final point of this video, the main takeaway that I want you to have. You can use this method, you can use the buffing wheel method, the whetstone method, the stropping method, any other type of method out there, but sharpening a knife really comes down to skill, and skill just takes time to build. So get out there and practice. Take an old knife that you don't care about much, and it doesn't matter what kind of money you spend, whether it's a little bit like this method or a lot bit like the buffing wheel method, just practice it. The more you practice it, the more familiar you'll get with the process, and you'll be able to get just the right angles, to get just the right edge. And it feels great whenever you put in all that time and effort and you're able to just make a knife that's like really stupid sharp. So yeah, have fun with it. Safely, of course. But yeah, that about does it for this video. Hopefully you found it helpful or entertaining, and if you did, make sure you hit that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button. And if you want to see a specific tutorial about something in the knife making world, yeah, let me know. I'll see what I can do about it. But until the next one, stay happy, healthy, wealthy, and wise. Be safe with making knives and everything, and I'll catch you in the next one. I said next one already. I still need to work on this outro. Bye.